I'm the one making those noises. I assume that's what it sounded like when an unmanned aerial vehicle exploded over the Kremlin Senate building around 3 a.m. local time on May 3rd. Last night, the Kyiv regime attempted a drone strike against the residence of the president of the Russian Federation at the Kremlin. That's what Putin's spokespeople said in an official statement the next day. Timely action by the military and special services involving radar systems enabled them to disable the devices. They crashed into the Kremlin grounds, scattering fragments without causing any casualties or damage. Earlier that same week, this is me again, this is not the Kremlin talking, explosions in the Bryansk region, which borders Ukraine, derailed 2 freight trains in 2 consecutive days. Train cars were knocked on their sides, stuff caught fire, dark gray smoke billowed into the air. It was really everything you've been conditioned to imagine when picturing a bomb that derails a train. A few days before those train incidents, a far more massive fire erupted at an oil depot in Crimea when 2 Ukrainian drones hit pay dirt and succeeded in igniting 4 oil tanks. As I'm recording these words, bloggers and news outlets in Russia are abuzz with speculation about what could be the start of Ukraine's long-awaited spring counteroffensive. Clueless observers like me and experts alike have had months to speculate about what shape the counteroffensive might take and what its chances of success are, but the recent attacks in Moscow, Bryansk, in Belgorod, and Crimea, they raise other questions about how the Russian authorities are guarding territories that are, from Kyiv's perspective, behind enemy lines. So just how is Russia defending against Ukrainian drone attacks and special operations? And what do these tactics mean for Kyiv's war effort? That's the subject of this week's show. Welcome to the Naked Pravda. Howdy, folks. Welcome back to the Naked Pravda. As always, I'm your host, Kevin Rothrock, the managing editor of Meduza's English language edition. On this week's episode, I spoke to 2 experts about drone attacks on targets inside Russia and Crimea, and about Ukrainian special operations behind enemy lines. Operations that derail trains, sabotage industrial production, and maybe even assassinate prominent pro-invasion propagandists. Before we get to those interviews, however, I'll turn it over to one of my colleagues for a brief message about Meduza's crowdfunding efforts.
Hello, this is Anna Razumная, one of Meduza's English side news editors, who bring you the daily breaking news and feature stories from Russia, as well as Ukraine, Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Although millions of our readers in both English and Russian live around the world, one of the key goals we're committed to is to continue providing accurate and uncensored information to our audience in Russia, where the state is daily ramping up its offensive on the independent press. This mission, of course, requires funding, and yet it has become dangerous for our readers in Russia to support Meduza. Vladimir Putin's regime has banned our publication, designating it an undesirable organization, which means that anyone who supports our work from within Russia risks facing criminal prosecution. But Vladimir Putin doesn't have to have the last word on whether Meduza gets to live or the Russian people's access to uncensored reporting. We would very much prefer this to be your decision. As a member of our international audience, you have a say in deciding the future. I'm talking about the future of the free Russian language press, about Meduza's future, but also about the future of Russian society, which depends on access to truthful information about the world. We ask you to contribute to sustaining our work at this important time, when this really does matter more than ever. If you like what we do, and if you believe in the importance of free media in a democratic society, please support us with your donation today. You can do this by following the Stand With Us link at the top of our website. And if you decide to donate to us today, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this show.
Okay, let's get back to this week's show by jumping right into the conversation that dominated speculation immediately following news reports about the 2 drones that hit the Kremlin on May 3rd. Was this a Ukrainian special op or a Russian false flag operation?
It seems to me that's probably unlikely they did a false flag here, because when you talk about the security services and the MOD and the senior elements of the Russian government, 2 UAVs hitting the Kremlin is a pretty embarrassing event for all of them.
You know that voice. It's Rob Lee, a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute who's been meticulously gathering operational data about the conflict since even before Russian troops started pouring over the Ukrainian border. Rob told me that Moscow had relatively little to gain from faking a drone attack against Russia's most symbolic fortress.
Right? It's embarrassing for Russia's leadership. It's embarrassing for the FSB, the MOD, FSO. You'd think they'd rather some kind of false flag that didn't make them look they're failing to do their jobs. And so, for that reason alone, I think the embarrassment is greater than anything this would have gains. I don't think there's too much upside in terms of getting more kind of popular support for the war in Russia, right? I'm not sure it was needed or played much of a role, or the timing made that much sense. And of course, look, Ukraine's defense intelligence has been doing a lot of quite kind of spectacular, operations inside Russia and Crimea, and they've had success, doing attacks on Russian air bases, right? Just damaging and destroying Russian bombers, a variety of strikes in Crimea. And personally, I assume, but I think people came to the assumption that the UAVs were launched from Ukraine and that was the only way they might get to Moscow. But my assumption is that a lot of the things that Ukraine's been doing is they've been operating behind, within Russia, within Crimea, or within occupied territories. They launch UAVs from there, and that makes it more difficult for Russian air defense to figure out where it's coming from because it's not, going across the front line where they pick it up and have time to destroy it. So anyway, I'm not sure exactly what happened. I don't have all the facts, but
Yeah.
the false flag idea here didn't really make too much sense to me. And I think, again, it strikes me that the more likely answer is that, Ukraine did this and Ukraine did it right before the Victory Day parade to kind of demonstrate maybe the weakness of the Russian government and, that they can strike anywhere they want to.
Right.
And, I think that's probably what the main reason was.
Also returning to the podcast is journalist Roman Dobrokhotov, the editor-in-chief of the news outlet The Insider, which often partners with Bellingcat on investigations related to the Russian and Ukrainian intelligence communities. Roman told me that the Russian military is no stranger to false flag operations, and researchers have had lots of practice identifying them, which is why he's confident that the Kremlin drone attack was not faked.
We see false flag operations very often, and that's why we understand that this time it is not false flag operations, because these false flag operations are usually very stupid, and it's very easy to see that they are false flag operations.
Hmm.
Like when we already were preparing that they would start a full scale invasion, we were waiting for what kind of false flag operation that would be, and many people even don't remember those several false flag operations they did because they were so silly and so low scale that no one even really paid it attention. So there were some people claimed to be Ukrainian intelligence who made some provocation on some chemical factory, which actually didn't happen. There were also some small building blown up on Russian border, and like also it was kind of Ukrainian attack. So it was so stupid and so useless for Ukraine that like no one would really attribute it to Ukraine. While here we see that actually it was very painful in sense of like Russian propaganda and what they have been speaking about for months about how actually Russia is strong and secure, and how it's good in defending our sky, etc. And suddenly we see that like right, actually, it was actually two drones, right? So two explosions on Kremlin. Well, even if it Kremlin would need some false flag operation like this, they would choose something different because the cost in image of Russian defense is bigger than any possible response Russia can do. They would never do a false flag operation like this one.
How difficult is it to detect drones like this, like the two that exploded over the Kremlin? I don't know. It's unclear if they were shot down, I guess, or that was if they blew up by design the way they did.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, how hard is it to say if you're in charge of air defense of Moscow? How hard is your job?
So UAVs are harder to see, I think, on radar, but they're easier if you know the direction they might come from, right? So Russian air defenses in Ukraine, if they know where the front line is, right, they know where to look, they know what to be on the lookout for. Part of the issue is that if you're an air defense crew in Moscow, you really don't want to make a mistake and have a false positive where nothing's in the air and you start firing 30 millimeter rounds around center of Moscow, right?
Because they have to come down somewhere, or
Yeah, so you don't want to fire missiles. You don't want to fire. We saw earlier this year that or last year Russia was putting Pantsir air defense systems on top of some of the buildings in Moscow, including on the MOD command center on the Frunskaya embankment. So electronic warfare is another way you can disrupt
What do
UAVs.
those things fire? The things you just mentioned. The
So Pantsir has a cannon,
Okay,
so it has two is 30 millimeter cannons, and it has missiles as well.
so it's shooting large shells, then like cannon shells, and it's also firing missiles that somehow lock onto things.
Right. So you can use either one. They used them in Syria. There was obviously, you might remember, on New Year's Day in 2018, there was an attack on Russia's airbase in Mamin in Syria, where a number of these kind of improvised UAVs managed to get through Russia's defenses. They managed to damage some Russian aircraft and kill some Russian servicemen. So I mean, it is possible. Pansirs were used heavily in Syria. After that attack happened, they actually started moving another kind of short range air defense system, Torum 2, to also provide additional security in at the airbase in Syria. And so, in this case, it could have been a number of things, right? So one, that the UAVs were coming from a direction they didn't expect. Maybe the kind of radar crews didn't pick them up properly. Maybe they did get some warning, but the people who were operating air defenses in Moscow were, reticent to kind of engage a target unless they were 100% sure, because obviously the fear of firing at nothing. So it could have been a number of things, but yeah. So I mean, again, nowadays UAVs, these UAVs are very long range. Russia is a huge, obviously, country. There's a lot of important sites to defend, and Ukraine has a lot of options, the things they can target within Russian territory, and it's impossible to defend everything with 100% confidence. And so, there are all sorts of issues that come about with this. And again, I'm not sure where this UAV was launched from, or what these two UAVs were launched from, but you can make it much more difficult for air defense crews if you launch them in certain directions, I'm sure, than others.
Roman Dobrokhotov says the Ukrainian military has started leveraging drones and high tech weaponry from the West to shift the balance in the war, changing the conflict fundamentally from the early days when Russia enjoyed major asymmetrical advantages.
A lot of operations like this in Russia lately. So, as we understand, these were small drones that were directed from some Moscow region. So, it's not like they flew from Ukraine, but it was from some Moscow region, and that definitely were some Ukrainian special forces. We don't know exactly what kind of intelligence. It is very likely that is a Ukrainian military intelligence, because they are mostly responsible for this kind of operations on Russian territory. But there are so many now different organizations and structures within Ukrainian military that is sometimes hard to guess. But this is, you see, we saw how they assassinated some of Russian propagandists. We saw their operations on Russian infrastructures like bridges or, I don't know, oil tankers or something like this. So this is pretty usual. What is unusual is that we see that, okay, it was a symbolic action. It wasn't really hurting that much Russian, I don't know, political institutions or military infrastructure. But in a symbolic sense, that is very, very painful for Vladimir Putin, because everybody see that like there is no safe place, no safe space on any part of Russian territory. And it's actually the second painful attack in 1 week, because it was these drone strikes, and also Ukraine successfully intercepted Russian missiles Kinzhal, that was like hyper sound missiles that kind of wonder what waffe
They're supposed to
that
be like
was
unbeatable, right? But
absolutely unbeatable. And Putin directly said that this cannot be intercepted. It was shown in like this famous cartoons shown
right.
during Putin's speeches, and everybody said that like this is not really that invincible. But now we have definite proof, and that means that actually there is no leverage, nothing in Putin's pocket anymore that he can use and that he can threaten Ukraine. And vice versa, Ukraine has something they can threaten Russia, because they can really reach Kremlin. Okay, this time these drones were very small and it was just a symbolic attack, but next time they can bring some more explosives on it. And they didn't use it during military parade, but who knows? They didn't use it because they couldn't or because they didn't want this time. I would bet on the second option actually, because as I understood this technological part of this attack, that there is no real capabilities that can stop this kind of small commercial drones because it's too complicated. All of air defense and anti-missile defense is targeted on really big missiles, nuclear missiles, or just something big that is flying from Europe and can be intercepted somewhere around Moscow before it enters actually Moscow region. But it is very, very difficult to do something against these kind of small attacks.
Right.
And these small attacks can be potentially very dangerous. If this kind of drone with some, I don't know, 5 kilos of explosives falls down on Red Square, it can kill hundreds of people. So yes, this time on the military parade they didn't use it, but there are so many other events in Kremlin and around that are public, that are scheduled, and it's very difficult to secure them from this kind of things happening. I think that Ukraine possibly don't want to escalate it too much for now, because yes, they have Patriot missiles, but not a lot of them. So possibly they don't want to escalate it right now, but it is important that they have it in their disposal.
Yeah.
So we had very big asymmetry like half a year ago when we saw that, yeah, Ukraine started to get HIMARS or some other weapons, but still Russia is like more than 10 times bigger in artillery. It has missiles that no one knows how to intercept, much more people, and blah blah blah. But now we see that, like, do Ukraine have anything like where it is worse than Russia still? So even in sense of like how many people they have, okay, Russia have millions of citizens, but how many trained people who are really prepared to the war Russia has right now? Missiles, there are so little number left, and even these missiles don't reach their targets in Ukraine. So, I don't think that right now we can see that Russia is actually really stronger than Ukraine, which was insane even to imagine like a year ago, even half a year ago.
Right.
But now, if you see what is discussed in Russia, it's not how we will get to Kyiv, it's how we need to defend our territory from counteroffensive. And with that, digging all this defense infrastructure also on Russian territory and in Crimea. It was supposed to be already Russian, like very secure territory that where no one would expect some Ukrainian soldiers. But now it is a real option. So many things changed in last months. We even don't notice the scale of it because it's going like very slowly. But these changes are very big in the distance on several months.
How expensive is it for Ukraine to send UAVs into Russia and to attack air bases and potentially and maybe the Kremlin? Like, is that a fairly cheap thing for Ukraine to do? They can keep pumping that out, or is it very costly?
Yeah, it's pretty cheap. I mean, it seems they're using like Chinese commercial UAVs. You can purchase on Alibaba.
Mm,
You can put some sticks of C4 in them, which are not that expensive, and it's not too difficult to do it. So as long as you've got as long as they're able to operate within Russia, and they can get enough of those UAVs into Russia wherever they're operating from, it's not that difficult to kind of do these things. And these UAVs are increasingly longer and longer range. Of course, the longer the range, the more likely they get shot down because Russia have more time to respond. But certainly they've been quite effective, and they've been quite effective in Crimea. I assume the big strike on Saki Air Base last year was likely from similar UAVs. We keep seeing other strikes in Sevastopol and elsewhere in Crimea that likely the same kind of thing.
So you've mentioned these repurposed Chinese UAVs that they're leveraging and using more. Is that the main arsenal for when it comes to attacking behind enemy lines, or do they have other weapons as well? Because I know there's usually reports of artillery fire, if I'm not mistaken, in some of the border regions. Like what weapons does Ukraine have currently that it's using to hit targets inside Russia?
So I haven't seen any evidence that they're using, say, NATO weapons to hit inside Russia.
Right.
It seems that it's mostly these kind of commercial systems. Most of the weapons that Ukraine has are short range, so to get this kind of longer range strike capability, I think it's a combination of using special operations units that operate kind of behind enemy lines, and then the combination of using UAVs. And of course, if you use UAVs instead of a special operations mission where you have to raid, an actual target and risk being captured, killed, so on, you operate with UAVs, it's much easier to get away with it. So,
Right.
it's a balance of cost, a balance of risk, all these kind of things. And of
And if
course,
you fail, big deal.
yeah, exactly. So even if UAVs get shot down, right, there's still a PR aspect to this. The fact that Ukraine can strike in Russia, and that Russia has to dedicate some air defense and other assets to defend things deeper in Russia. So not just on the front lines, but they have to have better kind of security at always air base and elsewhere. So all of that increases costs for Russia, makes it more difficult to kind of prosecute war. And again, these are pretty low cost options for Ukraine. So they're going to keep doing it. And of course, every once in a while, you have spectacular success, right? So
Right.
at Stocky Air Base, I suspect what happened was the UAVs were able to hit bombs that were or just laying around on the ground, and that's what created these massive explosions. Other strikes, obviously hit oil facilities, that can create a huge fire. Other times they've been less effective, but the more often you do it, the better chance you have of kind of spectacular success.
Right.
And of course, I think there's a morale factor too that Ukrainians, when they're being shelled, especially with kind of Russia's air campaign since like October, or striking civilian targets, I'm sure it's a bit of a morale boost when they see there are targets being struck in Russia as well, and that's not just them kind of being on the receiving end, but there's also a kind of proactive way to take the fight into Russian military positions in Russia itself.
And then the attacks on an area like Belgorod, that's just sort of standard artillery fire from Ukraine's own arsenal and old Soviet arsenal and who knows what.
So I'm not always sure. I mean, yes, I'm sure some of the stuff on the border, there's artillery and mortars, things of that nature. I think some of it's UAVs too. Depends how deep the targets are.
Right.
So, and I think there was that helicopter raid that happened back on like April 1st, I think, 2022. That was a very, very bold operation. So there's been a few different things, I think. And then again, I wouldn't be surprised there are Ukrainian saboteurs, soft operating across the border too.
Hmm.
We've seen all these train lines rail tracks get cut and things of that nature. It's certainly possible that it's cut from Ukraine as well. So, a variety of different things. But of course, things right across the border may have a more direct effect on the battlefield. Like if it's, oil facilities or rail lines, things that help support or transport, reinforce, whatever Russian troops in Ukraine, there's a more direct kind of effect of something right on the border might have to war in Ukraine, as opposed to kind of deeper strikes, which may be a bit more indirect.
When it comes to attributing these attacks, like you lean in the direction that the drone attack was likely Ukrainian. You mentioned that obviously there have been UAV attacks on like oil depots and things like that, and those are Ukrainian attacks as well. But then there are also like there's sometimes there's like arson attacks on railroad infrastructure. Sometimes there's bigger attacks that actually derail trains. There's arson attacks against recruitment centers inside Russia and things like that. Some of these attacks seem to be made by local Russians either acting for political reasons or maybe they're being blackmailed or something. There was some kind of call campaign where people were fooling people
Yeah.
into. There's like all kinds of reasons for it. How are you doing the attribution on your end? Like, are you looking at the technical requirements for specific attacks? Are you looking at like leaked communications or like public reactions from Kiev? Like, what's the evidence
Well,
available?
what we definitely never look at is public correction from Kiev. This is what we would never take into consideration. But well, we have our own sources, and we we speak with the people who organize this kind of attacks, and
Mhm.
we
In the Ukrainian
also
intelligence community?
in Ukrainian intelligence community, among Ukrainian politicians, and with everyone. So
Yeah.
and they, of course, they don't want to take responsibility all the time for these actions because they have Western partners, and you know there sometimes can be some political problems if you take responsibility on it. So they don't like to do this, but like, come on, who else can be like Japanese intelligence, or who else can do this? They sometimes say about something about Russian guerrilla, war and something like this. And
Yeah, did those guys exist?
there are some people in Russia who, like among anarchists, among ultra-right movements, who are ready to participate because it's just something they like to do. And I can't believe that there were some spontaneous actions from some kind of partisan guerrilla movement, but I would say that like 99% of these kind of operations were either directly organized by Ukrainian intelligence or were made by hands of some Russian people, but with control of Ukrainian intelligence. That's like all that we've seen was like this.
When I see videos of a Russian freight train knocked on its side, flames and smoke everywhere, one of my first questions, besides, is that CGI, is what impact that kind of thing has on Russia's military efforts. Was that train carrying the Ark of the Covenant? And are Moscow's hopes of conquest now lost forever? Or does it matter much at all?
It's hard for me to say. I'm sure it had some effects. Can you say tangibly this operation failed because of this or that? I can't. But
Yeah.
it's hard to say from open sources. But certainly there are effects. Hitting the Crimean Bridge, for example, certainly had an effect. Right, certainly disrupted Russia's ability to reinforce parts of the front, made kind of resupplying efforts more expensive, more difficult, took more time. So things of that nature. Especially if you do them right before the coming offensive, it could have a significant effect.
Mhm.
So I would not be surprised if we see rail junctions or key bridges or other things get targeted right before this happens, that make it more difficult for Russia to reinforce wherever Ukraine wants to kind of do the offensive.
Is it clear to you at all when you see like this train has been derailed or this like junction box has been blown up? When you see that from where you're sitting, is it like, oh, that looks like a Ukrainian special op? That looks like a disgruntled Russian teenager. Is that sort of thing obvious from afar, or could it be both? Or does derailing a train require so much that it's not amateurs? It's going to be special ops. And like, what do we know about that?
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah.
So, and look, earlier last year, there were a lot of fires at Russian factories. Some of these factories were, might have been relevant to the war effort. Some of them were not. And I think Russia always kind of has a lot of industrial issues at these factories, including ammunition factories. Had a lot of big explosions in the preceding years that I think were just due to lax safety standards.
Mhm.
I suspect that the number was certainly greater last year than normal. I'm sure Ukraine played a role in that, but there's any number of causes, and of course, it can't just be lax safety standards or people who are operating things in Russia are just not doing their jobs properly too. So hard from kind of my vantage point to kind of say
Sure.
which one which.
What about the bombings of various pro-invasion ideologues and propagandists? Does that clearly fit into Ukraine's military operations, or could that be local Russian stuff? Could that be splinter groups in Ukraine? It's kind of everything's on the table still, unclear.
Yes, I don't know. That's the short answer.
Yeah,
I suspect that there are a long list. Ukraine has come a long list of people of Russian soldiers and others who they say kind of perpetrated a lot of the war crimes in Bucha and elsewhere.
right, right.
And look, I would not be surprised if we see a long term campaign from Ukrainian intelligence to hunt down these people. Maybe something like what the Mossad did before. Obviously the war is the main effort. That's the main focus. So that's the main focus of Ukraine intelligence service and other ones. But I suspect, bringing war criminals to justice is going to be a long-term goal and kind of program that Ukrainian security services engage in as well. The ones, right now, I don't know. Like it's kind of hard to tell again from my view.
Sure. I also asked Rob if Russia is so overstretched in Ukraine that its defenses back home are effectively collapsing. Drones are hitting the Kremlin. Young men are now drafted by text message and denied exit from the country if they don't report to their recruitment office. Sounds kind of wild. But Rob urges caution against big assumptions about the state of the regime at home.
I don't know if it's falling apart. Certainly, the Russian military is fully engaged in the war, and they don't have.
Yeah.
And this is early on they invaded right with like 80% of their BTGs, and they even after the first month they begin to pull battalions from very high risk areas, right? So Tajikistan, from Abkhazia, so Ossetia, other kind of key areas with and Kaliningrad as well, where you typically want to keep a strong posture. the Russian military is fully committed to this war. Right? They're very, very involved. They have a minimal kind of presence elsewhere. Yeah, everything else is kind of economy of force. They, saw it to an extent today in the Victory Day parades. So, they're very, very involved. And that's true probably for most of Russia's security services too. Obviously, if there's a crisis, they'd be in a weaker position to respond. I suspect some of the things that we've seen in Nagorno-Karabakh last year, Russia would have responded in a more forceful way if they had the military capacity to do so, which they lack. But, saying that they, can't do anything, I'm not sure that's true. And of course, I think, the kind of security apparatus, right, to maintain domestic security and other things, that's always a focus of the Russian leadership. So I think that's still very much kind of in place. So, yes, I mean, certainly if certain crises come up, the Russian military is not that well positioned right now to respond to them. But, not sure that means they're incredibly vulnerable elsewhere, because I don't think anyone's going to invade Russia anytime soon.
Thanks for tuning in, folks. This has been The Naked Pravda, a podcast from Meduza in English. Remember that undesirable status back in Russia means our entire news outlet now relies on readers and listeners around the world to support our work. Please visit our website for information about how to become a contributor with one-time or recurring pledges. Thanks again. Until next week.